announcing today a major show of military force in the region.
In the dead of night, deep beneath the surface of the ocean, an unseen predator lurks, closing in on one of the most powerful military assets in the world, a U.S. aircraft carrier. This isn't a scene from a Hollywood movie, but a real-life confrontation that took place in the tense waters of international politics. A Venezuelan submarine, operating in the shadows, purposefully stalks the USS Gerald R. Ford, a symbol of American naval supremacy. What follows next is not just a test of military might, but a battle of nerves, technology, and strategy. On the USS Gerald R. Ford, crew members are monitoring their sonar systems when a strange blip appears on their radar. It's subtle at first, but soon, the unmistakable signs of a foreign submarine begin to take shape. The Venezuelan submarine, a formidable presence armed with ballistic missiles, isn't hiding anymore. It's closing in, staying just out of reach, testing the American defenses. But why? What could possibly drive a nation like Venezuela to provoke the United States in such a dangerous game of cat and mouse? This wasn't just a random encounter. The geopolitical landscape was on the edge. With the U.S. imposing sanctions on Venezuela, the Venezuelan government was sending a message, demonstrating their ability to challenge American dominance on the high seas. As tensions rise, the U.S. Navy remains calm and composed, their response calculated and precise. The aircraft carrier, surrounded by its escort ships, stays on course, fully aware that any wrong move could lead to disaster. Yet the situation remains eerily controlled. No shots are fired, no alarms are sounded. It's a standoff where technology and nerves of steel are the true weapons. The submarine, now clearly identified, begins to make its move. But it's not retreating or launching an attack. Instead, it's engaging in a psychological battle, maneuvering in a way that forces the U.S. Navy to react, to monitor its every move. The U.S. Navy, however, remains unfazed. Their response is a show of confidence. Their aircraft carrier continues its course, undeterred, as their sensors track every change in the submarine's depth and position. The Venezuelan sub may have been testing U.S. defenses, but it soon finds itself in a trap of its own making. As it moves, its location becomes increasingly predictable, and the U.S. Navy's multi-layered sonar systems make sure that every move is recorded. The tension in the waters intensifies, but the U.S. Navy, with its superior technology, gains the upper hand. A helicopter is dispatched to drop sonar buoys, expanding the detection network and ensuring that the submarine has nowhere to hide. It's a game of cat and mouse, but now, the mouse has no escape. The Venezuelan submarine, realizing the futility of its position, begins to slowly disengage, retreating into the depths of the ocean. This encounter didn't escalate into a full-blown conflict, but it demonstrated the power of modern naval tactics and technology. It showed how countries can challenge each other without firing a single shot, and how intelligence, patience, and nerves can become the deciding factors in a high-stakes military standoff. In the end, the message was clear. The waters of international politics are never calm, and even in the silence of the deep, power struggles unfold. In the early hours of the morning, as the USS Gerald R. Ford cruised steadily through the choppy waters of the Caribbean, an eerie calm hung over the massive aircraft carrier. The carrier's radar and sonar systems were constantly scanning the surrounding ocean, but all appeared clear. The crew was on high alert, as tensions had been rising due to the escalating political situation in Venezuela. The United States had recently imposed a new round of sanctions on Venezuela, severely affecting its oil industry, and the U.S. Navy had increased its presence in the region as part of its strategy to exert pressure on the Venezuelan government. However, no one aboard could have predicted what was about to unfold in the deep, silent expanse of the ocean. At exactly 2:17 a.m., an unusual echo appeared on the sonar screens. The American sailors initially dismissed it as another anomaly, perhaps a passing ship or the natural noises of the sea. But as the echo persisted, its signature became more defined, and it quickly became clear. This was no ordinary disturbance. It was a submarine, and it wasn't moving like any typical vessel. The submarine appeared to maintain a consistent depth and speed, almost as though it was deliberately staying in the carrier's sonar range. The pattern wasn't random, it was too precise, too intentional. The crew of the USS Gerald R. Ford quickly realized that this wasn't just an ordinary contact. This was something far more deliberate. The American aircraft carrier, part of a strike group led by the largest and most advanced carrier in the fleet, was on its way to support U.S. operations in Venezuela. The Venezuelan government, under pressure from international sanctions, had been struggling to maintain its power, and its naval forces had become more aggressive, perhaps as a way to show they would not back down. The presence of the submarine was unmistakably a challenge, an attempt to test the U.S. Navy's response time and readiness. The Venezuelan military knew that the USS Gerald R. Ford was the crown jewel of American naval power, and its very presence in the Caribbean was a statement of dominance. The question now was whether the U.S. would back down or stand firm in the face of this provocation. For the U.S. Navy, the situation was tense, but there was no panic. The crew on the aircraft carrier understood the importance of staying calm. The ship's command center was filled with experienced sailors who had trained for situations like this. Every officer knew their role, every system was in place, and the procedures for dealing with underwater threats were ready to be executed if necessary. Yet the crew kept their cool, monitoring the submarine's movements, understanding that this was not the time for rash decisions. The submarine, presumably a Russian-made Kilo class, was maintaining an unnervingly steady position, constantly adjusting its depth and course in ways that felt calculated. It was clear to the U.S. Navy that this was a deliberate act of provocation. The Venezuelans weren't trying to engage in combat, at least not yet. Instead, they were testing how far they could push the U.S. Navy, how close they could get to the American carrier without triggering a confrontation. As the situation unfolded, the USS Gerald R. Ford's escort ships, including the guided missile destroyer USS Porter, moved into position. They were ready to engage, but they were also operating with restraint. Their role was not just to defend the carrier, but to manage the situation without escalating it into a full-blown conflict. The aircraft carrier continued on its course, maintaining its speed and heading, as the submarine's movements were meticulously tracked by the carrier's sonar systems. The U.S. Navy's technological advantage was clear. The submarine, despite its stealthy maneuvers, was increasingly visible on radar and sonar. The USS Gerald R. Ford had a sophisticated network of sensors and countermeasures designed to detect and neutralize any potential underwater threats, and they were working as intended. The presence of the submarine near the carrier wasn't a random encounter. It was a deliberate challenge, a calculated move by Venezuela to demonstrate its willingness to stand up to U.S. pressure. The Venezuelan government, facing internal political unrest and international sanctions, had decided to send a message. They were not backing down. The submarine's close proximity to the USS Gerald R. Ford was not just an act of military posturing. It was a demonstration of Venezuela's resolve. It was a message to the United States, to the world, that Venezuela still had the ability to project power in the region, despite the heavy sanctions it was facing. And it was a challenge to the United States' strategic dominance in the Caribbean and Latin America. As the hours passed, the standoff between the submarine and the USS Gerald R. Ford continued. The Venezuelan sub, aware that it had been detected, maintained its position, clearly signaling that it was not looking for a fight, but rather for a demonstration of strength. The U.S. Navy, equally aware of the stakes, did not take the bait. Instead, they responded with measured control, ensuring that their presence in the region remained uncontested. It was a dangerous game of chicken, one that could have spiraled out of control with a single misstep, but the U.S. Navy's disciplined approach prevailed. The incident would go down in history not as a battle, but as a test of nerves, of technology, and of political will. As the USS Gerald R. Ford continued its course through the Caribbean, the Venezuelan submarine began to close in. At first, it was a faint signal on the sonar, a brief disturbance that seemed like just another echo from the deep. But as the moments passed, the behavior of the submarine became increasingly deliberate. The crew aboard the USS Gerald R. Ford quickly realized this wasn't a simple navigational anomaly. This was a purposeful act, a challenge, designed to provoke a reaction from the United States Navy. The Venezuelan submarine, an older Kilo-class vessel, was maneuvering with a sense of precision that didn't align with typical submarine operations. It seemed almost as if the submarine was intentionally maintaining a steady depth, staying at a specific distance from the aircraft carrier, and altering its speed in a way that was unmistakably calculated. It wasn't trying to hide, and it wasn't simply passing through. It was testing the U.S. Navy's vigilance. The submarine's sonar profile was consistent, and its movements appeared controlled, like a predator circling its prey. This behavior wasn't accidental. It was a statement, a message from Venezuela. The U.S. Navy immediately recognized that this was not just a random encounter. The presence of the submarine in such close proximity to a top-tier U.S. aircraft carrier was highly unusual. The timing couldn't have been more deliberate. The USS Gerald R. Ford, leading the U.S. Navy's strike group, was at the center of American military operations in the region. It had recently been sent to the Caribbean as part of a strategy to exert pressure on Venezuela, and its presence was seen by many as a signal of American power in the hemisphere. The Venezuelan government, under immense political and economic strain due to crippling sanctions, had been looking for ways to show its resistance to U.S. influence. The decision to send a submarine to shadow the USS Gerald R. Ford was, in many ways, a move of defiance, an assertion that, despite the sanctions, Venezuela still had the means to challenge U.S. naval superiority. What made the situation even more tense was the fact that the Venezuelan submarine wasn't just following the carrier from a safe distance. It was closing in. It was approaching at an angle that allowed it to shadow the USS Gerald R. Ford without appearing to be a direct threat. The movements were almost deliberate, calculated to put the U.S. Navy on edge without provoking an immediate military response. The submarine's crew, fully aware of the high stakes, was taking every precaution to remain undetected. They adjusted their depth to avoid sonar detection, but the USS Gerald R. Ford's advanced sonar systems were already closing in on their position. The ship's sonar operators had been trained for situations like this, and they quickly realized that the submarine's movements were not random. The crew of the USS Gerald R. Ford had to acknowledge that this was no ordinary reconnaissance operation. It was a message being sent in the form of tactical maneuvers. The submarine's proximity to the carrier began to rattle the crew, but they maintained their composure. The U.S. Navy knew it couldn't afford to make any mistakes, especially not when tensions in the region were already so high. Every action needed to be carefully considered. The USS Gerald R. Ford, along with its supporting ships, began to adjust its formations, creating a layered defense to track the submarine's every move. The situation was becoming increasingly dangerous, but the Navy's training and technology allowed them to maintain an upper hand. Still, the presence of the Venezuelan submarine, so close to the carrier, continued to be a mental game, a challenge to U.S. naval superiority. In a calculated move, the Venezuelan submarine adjusted its course again, drawing even closer to the USS Gerald R. Ford, now within an uncomfortably short distance. The crew aboard the carrier understood what was happening. This was no longer just a test of technology or sonar. It was a test of resolve. The Venezuelans weren't just trying to gather intelligence or test the capabilities of the U.S. Navy. They were sending a message that they were willing to take risks, that they were prepared to push the boundaries of what was acceptable in this high-stakes game. The U.S. Navy had seen challenges like this before, but the stakes had never been so high. The USS Gerald R. Ford, with its multi-billion-dollar sensors, radar systems, and countermeasures, was well-equipped to handle the situation. Yet the presence of a foreign submarine so close to such a critical asset made it clear that Venezuela was prepared to escalate the conflict. Perhaps not with missiles, but with the intent to challenge American authority in the region. The proximity of the Venezuelan submarine was not an accident. It was a clear signal that Venezuela was willing to go to great lengths to prove that it could still make waves in the waters of the Caribbean. And it was up to the United States Navy to decide how to respond. In the end, the Venezuelan submarine didn't launch an attack. It didn't need to. The mere act of shadowing the USS Gerald R. Ford was enough to send a message. Venezuela, despite the sanctions and international pressure, was willing to stand firm. The USS Gerald R. Ford and its escorts, on the other hand, stood their ground. The submarine's actions were an attempt to probe, to push, to test the limits of American resolve. And in that moment, both sides knew that the game of cat and mouse was far from over. As the tense situation between the USS Gerald R. Ford and the Venezuelan submarine progressed, the U.S. Navy responded with precision, their every move calculated. The presence of the submarine had now become undeniable, and it was clear that the crew aboard the American carrier and its accompanying ships were in a standoff with a nation that was willing to test the limits of American resolve. The USS Gerald R. Ford, though the most advanced aircraft carrier in the U.S. Navy, was not alone in this situation. It was flanked by a number of escort ships, including the guided missile destroyer USS Porter, which was equipped with advanced sonar and radar systems. The destroyer, along with other support vessels, immediately began to adjust their positions to maximize the tracking of the submarine. Every ship in the strike group was aware that the submarine, a high-tech Russian-designed Kilo-class vessel, was now within their detection range. But there was still a need to keep the situation from escalating. The U.S. Navy's response was methodical, relying on its superior technology to maintain control over the situation. The submarine's movements, initially seemingly random, were now predictable due to the precise calculations made by the USS Gerald R. Ford's sonar and radar systems. The submarine, which had been circling the carrier in an effort to evade detection, could no longer escape the Navy's watchful eye. The U.S. Navy's multi-layered detection systems were operating in full force, each ship's radar and sonar contributing to the overall picture of the submarine's movements. The Venezuelan submarine, realizing that it was under constant surveillance, attempted to shake off the pursuit. It began a series of evasive maneuvers, altering its depth and course in rapid succession. These movements were meant to confuse the U.S. Navy's sensors, making it harder to track the submarine's exact location. However, the U.S. Navy was prepared for this. The USS Gerald R. Ford sonar operators had been trained in detecting subtle changes in underwater patterns, and they quickly adapted to the submarine's tactics. The submarine's movements were not as random as they seemed. Every maneuver was being logged, analyzed, and calculated by the USS Gerald R. Ford's command center. The American fleet was playing a waiting game, allowing the submarine to reveal more of its behavior with each passing moment. The aircraft carrier's command center was a flurry of activity as officers analyzed the submarine's movements. But even as they tracked the Venezuelan vessel's every move, the Navy remained cautious. The waters in the Caribbean were far from calm, and the risk of escalation remained ever present. The U.S. Navy's approach was not just about superior technology. It was also about discipline and restraint. Despite the fact that the Venezuelan submarine was getting closer and closer to the USS Gerald R. Ford, the crew was under strict orders to avoid provoking the submarine unless absolutely necessary. Every action was measured, and every decision was calculated for the least risk of conflict. Then, in an unexpected move, the Venezuelan submarine began to show signs of aggression. It activated its own active sonar system, a bold move that immediately caught the attention of the USS Gerald R. Ford's crew. The Venezuelan submarine had been using passive sonar for most of the encounter, trying to avoid revealing its location. But now, the sudden activation of its active sonar system was like a challenge, a clear attempt to force the U.S. Navy's hand. Active sonar is loud and easily detectable by other sonar systems, so it was clear that the Venezuelan crew wanted to be noticed. They weren't simply trying to avoid detection anymore. They were signaling their presence in a way that forced the U.S. Navy to react. The response was swift. The USS Gerald R. Ford's crew, knowing that the situation could quickly spiral out of control, immediately activated their own sonar systems to counter the submarine's maneuver. The U.S. Navy's sonar system, highly advanced and capable of detecting even the slightest changes in the water's composition, began sending out pulses, pinpointing the submarine's exact location. In a matter of seconds, the position of the Venezuelan submarine was locked onto by the USS Gerald R. Ford's systems, and the U.S. Navy's network of ships and planes immediately began tracking it. As the submarine continued its aggressive maneuvers, the USS Gerald R. Ford's crew responded with a display of power, but not in the way the Venezuelans might have expected. The aircraft carrier's course remained unchanged. There was no abrupt turn, no retreat. Instead, the Navy used its technological advantage to continue monitoring the submarine, allowing it to track its movements with ease. The Venezuelan submarine had underestimated the ability of the U.S. Navy to stay calm under pressure. Despite being under the scrutiny of the U.S. Navy's highly sophisticated radar, sonar, and surveillance systems, the submarine's crew had no way of escaping detection. In the skies above, the Navy's surveillance aircraft and helicopters were ready to assist in the monitoring of the submarine. The MH-60R Seahawk helicopter, equipped with an array of sonar buoys, was deployed. These buoys would create an underwater network that would further isolate the Venezuelan submarine, making it nearly impossible for the sub to escape undetected. The helicopter flew in wide circles above the submarine, dropping the buoys into the water below, which would transmit real-time data back to the aircraft carrier's command center. These buoys would ensure that the submarine had no place to hide, regardless of how deeply it maneuvered. The actions of the helicopter were a clear demonstration of the U.S. Navy's capability to operate in coordination, using both air and sea assets to trap the submarine in an ever-decreasing net of surveillance. Meanwhile, the Venezuelan submarine continued to make evasive maneuvers, altering its depth and course in what seemed like a futile attempt to escape. Every move it made, from shifting deeper into the depths to changing its course at impossible angles, was tracked with precision by the U.S. Navy's sensors. The submarine, which had once held the initiative, now found itself caught in a web of surveillance. It was unable to break free of the U.S. Navy's watchful eyes. The more it tried to evade detection, the more predictable its movements became, and the less maneuvering room it had left. At this point, the Venezuelan submarine was no longer operating on its own terms. The standoff had shifted. The submarine's crew, realizing that their position was becoming increasingly precarious, began to alter their tactics. No longer was the submarine closing in on the USS Gerald R. Ford. Instead, it began to slowly retreat, increasing the distance between itself and the carrier. The U.S. Navy, having achieved its goal of establishing complete control over the situation, did not pursue. The submarine's movements were tracked, but no aggressive action was taken. The situation ended without any shots being fired, but the implications were clear. The Venezuelan submarine had made its move, testing the resolve and readiness of the U.S. Navy. But in the end, it was the American fleet that demonstrated its superiority, not through force, but through technology, coordination, and restraint. The standoff had been a test of nerve and tactics, and the U.S. Navy passed with flying colors. The Venezuelan submarine, having failed to break the U.S. Navy's dominance in the region, was forced to retreat. But the message had been sent. Venezuela was willing to take risks, and the U.S. Navy was ready for whatever came next.